I come to you today, you will scarcely be surprised, as a cultural Tory, but I fear that my literariness is the only thing which is markedly Tory about me. But the state of attitudes to Western literature certainly drive one to that position. I remember a grey, chilly afternoon in New Haven, no less, talking to the man John Hurst referred to before, the best-known literary critic in the world, Harold Bloom, and I said to him, "We're cultural conservatives, aren't we?" And this look of wild surmise of something almost like panic came into Harold's old Jewish eyes, a man proud to be the son of a New York garment worker, and he said, "Yes, I suppose that's what we are. We're cultural conservatives." And there was a degree of appall in that. And I suppose an assembly like this has to acknowledge that there are things to be appalled about in the conservative position and indeed in the literary and cultural, the civilizational position, which whether we delude ourselves into thinking we're conservative or liberal, we must, by necessity, revere. I suppose the thing which confronts us on a topic like this, when in Australian terms, and we're the only people in the world who use this verb in this way, we barrack for Western civilization. Our American friends would say we root for it, wouldn't they? The thing we have to confront is when we look at the most idealised, in some ways the very greatest peak of our literature and our civilisation, which is to say the Athens of Pericles. You think of Phidias and the Parthenon. You think of the formal perfection which completely leaves Shakespeare in the shade of something like the Oedipus Tyrannus of Sophocles. The analytical modernity of a historian like Thucydides. It's great stuff, isn't it? But it's the civilization that killed Socrates. When we think of the glories of Rome and where we'd be without it, then that marvellous passing of the baton from the emperors to the popes. I've just finished reading Robert Hughes' very invigorating new book about Rome. When we think of Rome, and for heaven's sake, you're looking at an idiot who named a literary magazine after a quotation from Pontius Pilate. You remember, when the high priests came to Pilate and said, "No, don't write at the top of the cross." As Pilate had commanded, it should be written in Hebrew and in Greek and in Latin, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." Don't write that. Write, "That's what he said he was." And Pilate said with that great patrician Roman arrogance, "Quod scripsi, scripsi." What I have written, I have written. Well, for heaven's sake, for God's sake, as we might say, Roman civilization crucified Christ, didn't it? Think of the greatest prose work of the last 500 years in Western literature. Think of Cervantes' Don Quixote, the depth of compassion, the wonderful farcical humour, Catholicism at its most deeply merciful and humane. Well, it's the civilization that brought us the Spanish Inquisition. It's the civilization that brought us the conquistadors' rape of what came to be South America. The thing a group of us like this, united in our love of Western civilization and of Western literature, has to confront is the depth of the wisdom in the remark of the greatest German and the greatest Jewish critic of the 20th century, Walter Benjamin, as we crass British and Australians say, Walter Benjamin, as our American comrades would have it. The thing which Benjamin said, which Susan Sontag was always very haunted by, was the history of civilization is always, at the same time, the history of barbarism. I mean, Plato, Aristotle, Christ, Shakespeare, Stalin, Hitler. Where do we go from there? Well, I should have a little bit to say in a narrow sense about Australian literature. How Australian is it, which is always the question with which we befuddle almost everything, but that's a self-defining quality for us, because we're a civilization which has inherited the glories of Western literature. It's inherited Shakespeare, it's inherited English law, and yet we're at the bottom of the world, and it's always confused us. So let's look at the idea of Australian literature as through the lens of what Andrew Roberts, taking the Churchillian phrase, would describe as the culture of the English-speaking peoples. Now, I'm just one voice in a crowd, but it seems to me that in the last 30 years, probably the bit of writing you might make the highest claim for written in this great land of ours is short novella. You could read it in an hour if you were quick. You could read it aloud probably in 2.5. And many of you will know it. It's a book published about 20 years ago called The Death of Napoleon, by a man who calls himself Simon Lees, but is known in the academic world as Pierre Ryckman. He's the man who came out with one of the bravest attacks on the particular perversion of Asian values that was Maoism at the height of its powers. Remember when we used to all, well, you lot probably didn't, but my lot did, sentimentalise the evil Chinese, idealise the idea of all that communal communism at the time of the Cultural Revolution, and Pierre stood up like a lion at a time when it was grossly unfashionable and said, what barbarism, what tyranny, what a devastation of the idea of civilization. He was speaking as a man who came very much from French European civilization, but he was also very much a deep student of Confucius and of Chinese civilization. Now, for what it's worth, in our Bunyip meritocracy, I think there is a case for saying Le Mort de Napoleon is the best bit of Australian writing in quite a long stretch. But the thing I'd say about Australian writing is it doesn't very easily fit into any particular net, but one of the One of the good things about us as a literary nation is that we want to claim the lot of it, no matter how contradictory it might be. I think of my dead friend, that very great poet, Peter Porter. If I could just quote a couple of lines from him: "The fire will come out of the sun, and I will look the heart of it." I think that's the voice of a very great poet. Now, the man fled his native Brisbane, at the age of 20 or so in the very early 1950s, and spent the next 60 years in London. Admittedly, he still sounded like an Australian. He still identified with being an Australian. And yet, in all sorts of ways, he was an absolute adoptive Londoner, and yet we claim him. We want him passionately as an Australian poet, and I'm not separate from that attitude. I want him too. Think of, who is far and away the most distinguished writer of fiction resident in this country? Well, we all know who he is. He's a man called J.M. Coetzee, born and bred in South Africa, and a man whose most dramatic and full-blooded work is a reflection of the horrors of South Africa, both during the apartheid period and in a novel like Disgrace, in the aftermath of apartheid. You'll remember the central situation in that book is that the academic who's been kicked out of university for what we might think were somewhat venial sexual sins with a student lives to see his daughter raped, and in some sense accepting of the horror of her condition. Well, I'm here to say that I'm very proud to accept John Coetzee as an Australian literary writer, and it's to his great credit that he behaves as a model Australian literary citizen. You'll see him writing blurbs for every book under the sun because he identifies with this country. It's interesting that his work has changed since he's come here. Obviously, it no longer reflects the turbulence of that South African drama, but it's become in various ways much more what would modishly be called metafiction. It's become much quieter. You read a book like Elizabeth Costello, and there's this old writer born in Melbourne. I think she fiddled around with the idea of Nora, James Joyce's wife. She goes on a cruise and meets a man she had an affair with. She comes out with an essay, and the essay is identical to an essay which was published under the name J.M. Coetzee. But she's a Melbourne-born character, and there's that fabulous section of Elizabeth Costello, I think it quotes Euripides perhaps at the start, where she talks about her sister, Australian-born too, who is a difficult woman, a thorny woman, and who is also a nun working for the poor of Africa and something by way of being a saint. People divide about late John Coetzee because it's tricksy and it's very quiet. But I happen to think it's wonderful. Now, what else could I recommend to you by way of the pluralistic riches of Australian literature? Well, the most dazzling debut by an Australian writer in living memory was a book called The Boat by a young man called Nam Le. Nam Le showed that there was a literary equivalent to the sort of the piquant spectacle of, I'm sure it's not true, but someone told me recently that there was only one girl in the year 12 of a very distinguished Melbourne high school who did not have an Asian background. Well, Nam is an extraordinary writer. He was a scholarship boy to Melbourne Grammar, and his first book, The Boat, well, I mean, among other things, it's a marvellous testament to the, I'm not sure if this would be widely acknowledged in this audience, but perhaps just this corner of the man's work, to Malcolm Fraser's attitude to immigration, 30 or 40 years ago. But Nam writes this book of short stories, which is full of novellas of the greatest variety. There are stories about South American street kids. There's a story about a young woman in contemporary Iran and the horrors of this violent, sexualized world. There's a story almost in the manner of Philip Roth about an old New Yorker being reunited with his musician daughter. It's something I would deeply recommend to you, and it's as atypical as the Death of Napoleon or the poetry of Peter Porter. It's not what we think of as Australian writing at all. Let's talk about that tradition and the fact that we're losing it by the day. Australians my age and older than me tend, if you put them up against a wall, to be able to quote things like The Man from Snowy River or Clancy of the Overflow. I'd written him a letter which I had, for want of better knowledge, sent to where I knew him years ago. On and on it goes. It's buried there like, somewhere in us, like the Agincourt speech or what have you. I think it would be a sad thing if we were to lose that Australian literature of the Bulletin period. My old teacher, Vincent Buckley, thought that the greatest work of 19th century Australia was somewhat different. It was that shaggy dog story, that immense shaggy dog story, Joseph Furphy's Such is Life. And I hesitate to quote the first line of that book to such an enterprising conservative audience as the one I confront, but I suspect it might touch some anarchic spirit in you. Where else but in this country could a great novel begin with the line, "unemployed at last"? I mean, for heaven's sake, we're a country, and surely it is to our great credit, and it's something to feel patriotic about, that the unofficial hymn of Australia could be something as bleakly comical as Waltzing Matilda. And at some level, when we see Cathy Freeman, kneeling in the dirt, getting a sense of herself back after her great victories, isn't that what we hear in our head rather than that mock British pomp and glory of advanced Australia Fair? I don't know. We need Patterson. We need Lawson. Lawson is a greater writer than Patterson. Another bit of heresy. Think of that dreadful title, "For the Union Buries its Dead," one of the greatest short masterpieces in Australian literature. Or The Bush Undertaker. I remember I was in England when I heard the news that old Manning Clark had died. Now there was a man, a knight of the sorrowful countenance, to invoke Don Quixote, and probably a man whose general line on history wouldn't be particularly popular with people here. But I couldn't think of anything to do, and it's the corniest thing in the world. But I was in the chapel. I was in the chapel of Balliol, and it was completely empty, and no one was going to pounce pounce on marauding, cooeying Aussies. And I went up to the altar and I quoted, as I could remember it, the end of The Bush Undertaker by Lawson. And of course, the point in that is that the woebegone bloke in the bush, he can't remember I am the resurrection and the life, he who believes in me. And so it goes. He says, something ought to be did. Something ought to be said. I am the resurrection, you know. And everything is lame, everything is warped, everything is overwhelmed by the dark, encircling mystery of the Australian bush and the threat of this place, Australia. We should still be giving this stuff to our kids. You know, when J.I.M. Stewart, wonderful man who was trapped in Adelaide during the war as jury professor, he was asked to write about Australian literature in about 1940, and he said, there isn't any, so I'm going to talk about D.H. Lawrence's Kangaroo. Now, that was a few years after Henry Handel